Hello, everybody. Welcome to the it's August. I almost said September. Not quite September yet. The August Mountain View in San Francisco virtual meetup, featuring myself, but mostly featuring Doug Parker, who is joining us.
Howdy.
I'll do a quick introduction and go over some housekeeping, but thank you all for joining us, everybody on YouTube and Twitter or X or whatever you prefer to call it. Welcome. In case anybody can't make it for this whole stream, this will be live, or this will be recorded, so you can check it out at the same URL on YouTube. But thank you for being a part of our meetup community. And if you're just joining in on Twitter or joining in on YouTube, welcome as well. Couple housekeeping things. So we have a developer satisfaction survey for which I have a link. But if you are an Angular developer, we would really, really, really love if you could fill this out. I will post it in the chat. And I can even pop it up on the screen because we're fancy around here. So please check that out. Yeah, it's down. Nope, down there. I should have done.
I know my right from my left.
Sometimes on the screen it's tough to tell. Hi, Chaos Money. Hi, Justin. Hi, Michael. Hi, Agya. Very happy to have you all here. So yes, please fill out the developer satisfaction survey. This is a really helpful way for us to find out what's going on, how everybody's using Angular, how we can continue to make it better, and it's really an opportunity for your voices to be heard. So please fill that out. We also have another exciting stream coming up next week. If you need some games and some Mark Thompson and some Jeremy Elborn in your life, this is the place to be. There will be another stream on Friday at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. So definitely would love for you to join there. The more people show up, the more I can say that it was all because of me. So that's the goal. I need to make Mark know that I'm useful.
You're really influencing here and getting.
That's right. Yeah. I'm an influencer, but I don't get paid the big bucks. I'm like, aspiring influencer.
Someday.
Pay me one day. And then just quickly, we haven't had a lot of news, but the latest news I would say is that 16.2 is out. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, 16.2 is very exciting. There's lots of cool new stuff in there. You can always update with ng update. And today, like I said, we're here with Doug Parker, software engineer on the Angular team at Google, and he's going to be talking about tooling. So we'll do some chat about tooling. We'll have time for a Q&A afterwards. So if you have any questions, save them until the end. Or I don't know, Doug. It's up to you. However you prefer to do it. If you want to do questions at the end, or if you don't mind pausing in the middle, I can also use my discretion and.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the end is probably easier just to not spend too much time on that, but definitely, you can throw out questions early just to get them in the list and
for sure. Yeah, no, definitely. If you don't want to forget a question, just put it in the chat. I save all the questions, and then we can go through them at the end.
Right. And I might see some of those and be able to address them.
Yeah, by all means.
I also might not see other questions. So.
By all means. So I think here I can just turn it over to Doug. Let me switch nope, that's not it. Switch this, and I will move you to the top because you're more important than I am. And I will hide this survey, but please check out the survey.
All right. Everybody is equally important. Okay, you matter too.
Well, we could try to. We'll fix the layout and make us, on the same level next time.
All right. Well, I guess I can just jump in then. So thanks, Kevin, for organizing all this and setting all this up. This is super cool to be here and have this kind of opportunity to talk with the community. Like Kevin said, my name is Doug Parker. I'm a member of the Angular tooling team. So tooling is kind of a sub-team within Angular where we have a little bit more specific goals and objectives that I kind of want to talk about. So let's start with, we can just dive into what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing is just sort of what is Angular tooling? Who's on the team? What does this mean? What does that really represent? Sort of what are our goals? Why is this a separate sub-team within Angular? How is that distinct from the rest of Angular? as well as sort of what are the new features, what's coming soon. Kevin was talking about 16.2. We're going to be showing a lot of 16.2 features. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And then also just sort of where are we going? What is sort of the longer term direction that we're trying to take tooling, and how does that impact developers? And these are kind of like the specific things I'm going to be talking about, but really kind of my goal for this presentation is to just sort of help communicate some of what Angular tooling does to Angular developers. A lot of times, a lot of discussion can tend to get kind of overshadowed by the bigger, flashier features of things like signals or control flow. And those are great things, and we should definitely be excited about those. But also kind of want to give some focus to some of the other pieces that aren't quite as visible, but often have just as much of an impact on your developer experience, on the user experience. So I want to kind of use this opportunity to call out what that means. So firstly, just kind of who even is this team? What does that represent? So the tooling team, the main members are Alan, Charles, and myself. We're all on GitHub and have a few different social aliases. But essentially, we're kind of the main tooling team that has our hands in a lot of different things. We also have a few contractors. Alex Baduri and Sumit Arora also help us with a lot of this stuff, particularly in DevTools. And what's particularly interesting within the tooling space is that we actually end up interfacing with a lot of different individuals, both within Angular itself and also other projects and teams, whether that's working with Chrome and other organizations at Google, or working with cloud providers or tools that build on top of Angular. We end up interacting with a lot of those individuals. And so I kind of think that the scope of what tooling does is often not just individual projects, but also just making sure we work with others in the most productive way possible to build the biggest ecosystem that we can do. So with that in mind, sort of what is Angular tooling? What is an Angular tool, quote unquote? What does that mean? And I don't have a great definition for this, to be honest. If somebody has a definition, I'd love to hear it, because it's a more nuanced question than you might think. But the way that I perceive it is that an Angular tool is sort of anything we support which runs outside of the user's browser. And that's not a perfect definition, but it's kind of close enough for what I think of it as. And this includes a whole bunch of different things. So to start with, we sort of have like Angular CLI is probably the most notable thing that we maintain. It's kind of the first thing that usually comes to people's minds. We have server-side rendering, build-time pre-rendering. Those are the universal side of this equation, which again kind of skirts the it's kind of running in the user's browser. We also have DevTools, the DevTools extension for Chrome and Firefox, schematics, being able to generate code. All these things sort of contribute to your developer experience in little ways that you might not always notice. But this goes a lot broader, right? We've got testing and unit testing, end-to-end testing, the way that you internationalize code, the way that you interact with other browser APIs like progressive web apps and service workers, web components, that kind of thing. And we also sort of work very closely on building out the library ecosystem for Angular and how well we integrate with the web ecosystem. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that we sort of are involved in a lot of interesting areas. And so that's kind of why I want to bring some of this attention to the community. It's something to focus on. But I do want to be clear that a lot of the stuff that I'm showing here is not stuff that's not entirely necessarily owned or implemented by the three of us on the Angular tooling team, but they are all projects that we're involved in and have discussions about and help design and validate and have influence over. And so these are the big pieces that we're looking into. So that's where I want to kind of set some expectations for what the scope of this kind of project is. So with that, what are the longer term goals, right? Why is Angular tooling sort of a distinct team under Angular? How are we different from the other groups? And so what I like to think of this is that we have slightly different goals. We have something like we want to make things streamlined. We want to have Angular be a cohesive product on its own, where you don't necessarily need to think about how DevTools interfaces with the framework and how to get things loaded or connected together. This is something that should just work out of the box and that you don't need to worry about all the configuration nonsense. I want to be able to use Angular without necessarily I want to be able to give you a documentation page that says, here's how you get started with Angular. And I don't want that to include then 5 pages of how to configure your Webpack config to successfully build Angular. That's just not a great experience. That's not what we want to do. So we want to do this for you with our tooling and infrastructure. Next big thing is just being integrated. Where I like to think of this is that having a bunch of distinct tools that all solve individual problems is great and helpful on its own. But a lot of times that doesn't necessarily solve the overall story or objective for a developer who's trying to be productive, trying to solve some problem for their organization. And so we want something that integrates all these tools together and gets the best of them so that you don't have to worry about plugging them in together, about trying to use them or dealing with their nuances, and just having something that connects these all together and sort of creates that singular product that is Angular. Next, I want something that's sort of production ready. That's where we're able to build a sufficient amount of tooling such that you can meet all the major problems you need to solve and meet those and then ship all the way to production without necessarily having to pull in a whole bunch of external tooling in order to meet those problems. So this is where I like to think that, like, if I'm building a startup and I want to create a new Angular app, start solving some problems, being able to get users onto this app, meet their needs, and then sell this at IPO and make a lot of money and retire onto an island. I want to do that, and I want to be able to take Angular that whole process without necessarily having to bring in a whole bunch of other stuff to solve these problems that Angular couldn't do for me. So we want to have a sufficient story there to be able to meet those needs. And the last step I want to point out is that we try to define best practices. That is, that Angular is ultimately a very opinionated framework. We have strong feelings about how and what you should do for certain problems. And so we want to provide well-lit paths to solve those common problems, both within Angular for broader web development and also within just general software engineering, right? There are best practices for how to do these things. And so we want to incorporate those into Angular, provide well-lit paths to solve those problems, and also include guardrails so that it's hard for you to fall off that path just because maybe you forgot about this one little accessibility nuance that you didn't think of. We want to provide those guardrails to keep you on that path and get the best benefit out of them. So with all that philosophical stuff out of the way, let's talk more about the actual technology. So what are sort of the new things and what are we working on? What's in the pipeline? So the first thing I want to talk about is the build system in the Angular CLI. If you're not aware, we've been ongoing with a migration from Webpack to ESBuild. If you're not aware of what those terms mean, I don't blame you. This ecosystem is complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of proper nouns. Half my job is just understanding proper nouns and logos and how those fit together in really weird ways. So essentially, in the past, what we've done is had Webpack to serve as our bundler and build system for Angular CLI. When you run ng-build and ng-serve, Webpack is the thing under the hood that's actually doing a lot of the work here. And while Webpack has been great for us in the long term, we've had a lot of success with it. It has had some challenges around performance and scalability for large applications. And so we've been moving over to ESBuild, which is a newer system implemented with Go and native tooling. It has a particular focus on performance and is significantly faster than Webpack in a lot of respects. It's a little bit more narrowly scoped. It's more of a bundler than a build system. But the main thing is that this gives us significantly improved performance for development builds. And this is where we've been pushing a lot on trying to get Angular CLI and the ecosystem more and more onto ESBuild, get the performance benefits that gives and make your builds really fast. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be building a lot. You run ng-serve and then you start typing in some files and saving them. And then it's just building, 10 times in the background every little change you make. And so we want to get that as fast as possible because that's the thing you're going to be doing most of the time. And what's been super cool about this is it's currently in developer preview, and we've run out a few benchmarks to try and see what the performance gains are. And one in particular I want to call out is that the material documentation site was recently switched over to ESBuild, and that saw over 62% faster builds, which is just incredible to me. That we can have that kind of impact with one change. And this is measuring the wall time for production builds in this particular case. Things are a little bit different if you are focusing on development builds, and certainly every application is different. This particular one is very SaaS heavy. So SaaS is actually oftentimes the critical path here. So if you have other things in the process, you might be doing better, maybe a little bit worse, but these are the kinds of things that we've been seeing from our benchmarks. So this is what we're really excited about, trying to ship this to every Angular app ever. That's what we're really interested in. The next thing on this line is that we've been integrating Vite with this as well. So Vite is a sort of a build system / dev server. A lot of slashes in these things, the tools that do multiple things. And so Vite is trying to take on some of what Webpack has done in the past. We've been using this as a dev server. So while it is a full build system, it's not quite the way we're using it. We actually do things slightly differently, where we pre-build your application with ESBuild and then sort of pass your JavaScript files onto Vite and let Vite do the dev serving. It's a little bit different than the way the rest of the ecosystem does things, but we found that Vite is a really good dev server. It has great HMR support that we want to leverage. I'll talk more about that later. And we've been seeing a lot of success here. And again, just more build time improvements with this approach. So we're very excited about leveraging Vite. And what's super cool about this is that if you're like me, you're very lazy and don't want to spend effort on upgrading and changing things. So currently we've got this down to a one-line change if you want to try this out yourself. Essentially, you find your browser builder in angular.json and you update it to browser ESBuild. And that should be sufficient to enable ESBuild for your toolchain when you run ng-build. Also, when you ng-serve, that will also run Vite in the background and all the ESBuild stuff under the hood. So you can give that a shot today and see what kind of build improvements you're seeing. I definitely love to see people on social media posting about how their build times have dropped from this one change. So I definitely recommend trying that out. Going forward in this space, kind of what our goals are here is to currently this is in developer preview. It's actually pretty close to done, to be honest. There's only sort of a few smaller features that aren't quite there yet to get compatibility with Webpack. So there is some documentation. You can check it out yourself and see what those specifics are and how to enable it with a little bit more detail than I've given here. And so going forward, kind of our goal here is can we get the whole ecosystem from Webpack over to ESBuild? And there's a lot of complexity in that. I think to start with, we can get something that ng-new can use this by default. ng-update existing apps to switch over to this. Those are great starting points. And we think that we can do that pretty straightforward. However, there's a lot of existing infrastructure that sort of makes assumptions that Angular is built with Webpack, which gets challenging for sure. So it's going to be, we're going to have to figure out what the best way of handling that is and see how we can get the ecosystem over to ESBuild. Beyond that, the next big build improvements are going to be figuring out the next biggest blockers on the critical path and what we can do to make those easier or go away. So for example, there's been a lot of work in the Angular compiler about removing type checking from the critical path so that we don't need to run TypeScript. We don't need to analyze all your types. We can just immediately emit JavaScript as soon as we want to, and then maybe in the background run type checking and report some results when that's done. That way you still get the benefits of type checking, but you can immediately see what's going on. And kind of in that mindset, we're also exploring hot module replacement, what that can look like. Vite has great support for HMR. And by using this, we can essentially provide a system whereby changes to Angular templates or the style sheet can immediately be applied to an existing web page without having to refresh things. So if you're looking at a dialog and trying to adjust some styles to get, just perfect positioning on it, you can edit that directly in the editor, get instant updates in your application, and you don't even have to refresh. You don't even have to reopen that dialog every time you're editing it. So we think there's a lot of improvements here for builds, and we have a long road ahead, but I think there's absolutely a path to landing this, and we're really excited to see that happen. So the next big thing I want to talk about is server-side rendering. Now, I'm going to give a brief overview of what that means. Server-side rendering is a deep concept, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. But essentially, the idea is when the user first requests your application from the server, let's render that application on the server itself. Let's run Angular inside the server and then send the result, the rendered application, back to the client. This way, they get immediate access to your application. And the light is turning off on me. First, you turn on the light so people can see you. Then you server-side render your application. So I can remember where I was there. Once server-side rendered, you just sort of send that back to the client. They can immediately view the full application right away, and then Angular bootstraps on top of that afterwards. And so why would you want to do this? Why is this so important? The main thing is that this gives you improved performance. Applications are able to, or the user is able to immediately see your application even before the JavaScript has actually been downloaded and executed. You can also make this more accessible for mobile devices, maybe devices that are on they're lower powered or cheaper devices, maybe on poor connectivity, things like that. You're just making your site more accessible by adding this kind of functionality. You also get improved Core Web Vitals. That's the system being pushed by Chrome to kind of measure and define metrics around what good website performance looks like and how that can be improved. So as we server-side render things, the application loads faster, Core Web Vitals go up. And when Core Web Vitals go up, that means you get improved SEO. Search engines will prefer applications that run faster. And so that's a big part of the benefits here. Not to mention, when you have something that's faster, more accessible, is more discoverable, you get happier users. And ultimately, that's kind of our goal as software engineers. We're trying to make users happy and solve problems for them. So the challenge with this is that server-side rendering has kind of been difficult in the past with Angular. It sort of required this separate project called Universal, it was originally a community thing. It's now more adopted, but it's still sort of the separate thing you have to worry about. And when you'd set it up, it would give you over 50 lines of configuration of just nonsense in your angular.json file. And I feel like I, as an Angular tooling engineer, should understand what that's doing. And even I can't follow it half the time. So I don't know how typical Angular developers deal with this. Not to mention, it had a bunch of weird hacks and requirements to it. It needed CommonJS, and it even duplicated a lot of the build process, by which I mean it just sort of was significantly slower for not very good reasons. And when I say that, what I mean is that when we typically build an application in Angular, we sort of take in your main.ts file that's going to run your application on the client side. We type check this, we transpile it, optimize it, and then output some JavaScript code. This is an overly simplified version of what that looks like, but this is kind of the process for building a client-side application. And when we introduced server-side rendering, we basically just copied this whole thing. We're like, actually, well, we need to start with the main.server file, but otherwise we need to basically do the same thing and then output some server JavaScript. And if you're like me, you look at this as a software engineer and you're just like, this screams duplication, right? There's so much wasted effort, so much stuff going on here that we just don't need to deal with, right? There's got to be a better way to this. So what we've been experimenting with recently is, can we have a single pipeline that's able to support both of these, where it takes in both the client-side JavaScript, or the client-side version of your TypeScript, and the server-side version, type checks, transpiles, optimizes, does all of that together all at once, and then you get out both of the outputs. This way, you're just doing significantly less work, right? We only need to run TypeScript once. We only need to do transpilation once. And with this, we get faster builds, right? Just doing less work, everything's going to move faster. So we've been experimenting with this in what we're calling the application builder. This essentially replaces a few existing builders. You might be familiar with Browser. I kind of showed that earlier with the ES-Build stuff. But there's also a bunch of other ones, the server, SSR dev server, pre-render. These are all things that Universal previously generated. And what Application Builder does is replaces all of those and gives you just this one all-in-one Angular application builder. The idea is that I don't necessarily want to build just the browser or just the server. I want to just do everything, right? I want to build an application. And that application includes some client-side stuff, some server-side stuff, some pre-rendering stuff. But exactly which of those I'm doing is kind of, specific to the options of my application. And ultimately, my goal as a developer, my intent is to build an application. So that's something that I'm really excited about for simplifying a lot of this process. And main thing is that it makes it really easy to enable server-side rendering and even build time pre-rendering. There's just maybe an option that you can set rather than having to have all this configuration, all this nonsense you have to deal with. So as one example of how this might look, we can essentially replace the browser builder with an application builder. And then underneath that, we kind of set up some options to just give it some entry points. Say, here's my server entry point. And here's how to build all that. This is not a complete example. Some of the files do require edits compared to what Universal previously generated. But the idea here is that we can have this one builder which does everything you need to do. And it's something that we can theoretically ng update to, that we can actually have as part of an ng update, migrate your existing builds over to this and gain all the benefits of that reduced duplication, and also make things easier to understand and leverage going forward. So when you want to add server-side rendering, you just add in the entry point here and you're good. So with that, kind of where we're going with Application Builder, what we're trying to do here is currently in developer preview for 16.2. The documentation is a little bit lacking at the moment, but it's definitely something we're going to be pushing in the near future. And this is just sort of main benefits here are just having reduced configuration, and it's much easier to enable SSR, which we're really excited about. Not to mention, it also includes ESBuild and Vite by default. So this is kind of, again, building on a lot of that infrastructure. So not just are you getting that reduced pipeline and reduced duplication, but also it's using ESBuild to compile things even faster. And also the dev server is using Vite and integrates with your actual production server in a way that the existing setup really didn't do a good job with. So we're really excited about these improvements, and we think that this makes the whole developer experience for universal applications significantly easier. And so going forward, our goal is can we move the whole ecosystem to application? Can we get an ng update that performs this migration for you? And also, can we continue this kind of mindset into a library builder? So I was talking before about how application builder is kind of helping express this user intent that I want to build an application and give me all the things I need to do that. What's great with we sort of have a similar problem with ng packager. So can we get the same impact by making a library builder? Again, targeted around, I want to build a library. What are all the things I need to do to make that happen? And can we also bring in ESBuild improvements into there and make the library experience even better? So we're still in the early stages of that, but it's something we're thinking about and something we want to continue to explore in the future. There are also a few sort of random improvements I wanted to call out and how they sort of come together in a unique way. So we recently implemented ESM support for server-side rendering. I was talking earlier about how this required CommonJS. CommonJS was kind of an older format for how you can load code from different files. And nowadays we have native ECMAScript modules, right? We can use import and export syntax directly in the JavaScript language. So we've added that support for application builder. And on top of that, we added native fetch support to HTTP clients, right? Again, sort of modernizing a bit of the infrastructure there. And the last piece I want to call out is that our server bundles are a bit smaller. We used to be pulling in the compiler in a way that we really shouldn't have been. And these seem like sort of random small improvements. But what's great about this is that they all come together in making your deployments easier, specifically around edge workers. If you're deploying to the edge, you have a little bit more specific constraints. Those systems tend not to support CommonJS. They tend to have strict bundle size limitations because they need your server to be under a certain size just so they can load it effectively and as fast as they need to. Not to mention, if you're deploying to alternate JavaScript runtimes, such as Dino, Dino does not support XML HTTP requests, which was the thing that HTTP client used previously. So if you tried to ship your Angular app on Dino, it would immediately fail because Dino doesn't support the API that's needed. So by adding fetch, we're able to solve that problem automatically, and that now it just uses fetch. And Dino is fine with that. So this, I think, is a great example of some of those little things that you really don't think about until they start breaking, and then everything is frustrating and you can't deploy, you can't do what you want to do. And these are exactly the kind of thing that as tooling developers, we really want to solve for you. We want to remove these roadblocks and clean up all these little things that add up into big problems. So I just think that's great to call out, is like the little things that add up in a unique way for tooling. Next space I want to talk about is hydration. So hydration, similar to SSR, it's a very big concept. I don't have time to get into all the specifics on it. I will give a quick overview, which is essentially that when the application server-side renders, it passes a whole bunch of DOM to the application, and then Angular bootstraps itself and needs to make that interactive. Needs to pick up where the server left off. The challenge is that in the past, we really didn't do this. We did destructive hydration, which is really just not hydration, where essentially the Angular application would bootstrap and it would say, well, you know, this is great. I love that you already pre-rendered this DOM, and that's fantastic. But you might not have heard, I'm kind of the new application on the block, and I just that DOM seems weird and scary, and I don't understand that. So we're just going to push that off to the side a little bit, and then I'm just going to re-render myself from scratch. And this is an approach, I guess, but it's definitely not ideal, and it really just throws away a lot of information that we should be able to use. So the idea for hydration is, can we restore what the server was already doing? Can we restore some of that state and be able to use that to optimize the client without having to redo all this work from scratch? So to demonstrate this, I want to show off the Angular Movies app. This is an open source repository done by one of the Google developer experts. It's something that was built to be built with very high performance needs in mind, saying how fast can we make an Angular application? And so for us, that was an interesting challenge because we want to see, if I throw hydration at this, how can we improve the performance of an already pretty well optimized app? So what we saw by looking at the performance profiling of this, before we've done hydration, we can see here that in this little timeline, we're able to immediately display the application right up front. That's server-side rendering kicking in. That's the HTML that we've sent with this already rendered application, which is fantastic. But then it just kind of disappears, and you get this weird flicker where it disappears and then pops back in. And what's happening here is this is the application downloading and executing JavaScript, destroying the initial DOM, being I don't know what that is, and then re-rendering itself from scratch. And so you get this weird flicker. And as a user, you see the app pop in, you're like, oh, there's a button over here. I want to click that, or I want to start scrolling and start looking at things. And then it just disappears and then reappears after a second. And it's very jarring, very disorienting experience. So what we try to do with this is how can we improve this with hydration? And when we enable hydration, you see that this flicker completely goes away. And you get a much smoother user experience where everything just sort of pops in exactly the way that you would expect. And what's happening here is that the Angular application is starting, but then it sees this DOM, it understands what that is, it's able to resume and make that interactive without necessarily having to destroy and re-render things from scratch. So we're really excited about all of this, and I think it creates a much better user experience. So we did do some performance analytics of this. I felt that was important to look into. And the simple answer is that things get way faster. These are all the Core Web Vitals scores for what that looks like. And there's a bunch of numbers. You don't necessarily need to follow all those. But the one that I want to call out in particular is the LCP store, the largest contentful paint. And beforehand, this was 2.6 seconds. After hydration, it's 1.4. So that's almost a 50% improvement in LCP. If you're not familiar with LCP, that is essentially the time it takes to paint the largest image or text block on the page. So in this particular case, it's roughly how long it takes to display that Wakanda Forever poster. Because that's sort of the thing that's like, this is the main part of the application. This is what the user should be looking at. And until that happens to the user, it doesn't feel like it's loaded. So this is where the sooner we can make that happen, the better. And that's where we're seeing that we were able to cut that by 50% just by enabling hydration. And what's even cooler about this is that it was a 2-line change. All we had to do was import, provide client hydration, and then add it to Bootstrap application. And that was it. That was the entire change. And those 2 lines gave a 50% LCP improvement to this already pretty heavily optimized Angular application. So you can tell we're really excited about this. I think this is fantastic. I love to see where we can take this going forward. So where exactly are we right now with hydration? It's currently in developer preview in 16.2. The one nuance I'll throw at this is that some components might not necessarily be compatible. This is where if you have a component that in ng on init, let's say, queries the DOM and then grabs an element and removes it from the DOM. That's something that can confuse hydration. It kind of expects a similar DOM structure before and after server-side rendering. That said, in practice, we've seen that most components seem to be compatible with this. In that Angular Movies app, I wasn't lying. It was a 2-line change. It didn't need to update any other components. So this is something that I think in practice is not going to be too much of a problem. And even if some components don't work, you can opt those out specifically and still get most of the benefits of hydration, even if there are some specific components that can't themselves hydrate. So there is some documentation on here. I definitely encourage you to check it out. If you're already running server-side rendering, definitely it's something to play around with, see what kind of performance increases you get. Something that we're going to be pushing on much more strongly in the future. And so going forward, some of the things that we're thinking about including here. First thing is, can we get Angular to stream this content? Can we get the HTML to stream in real time to the user as it's being rendered? Historically, this has been very difficult with the way that Zone.js works. And so with recent improvements to signals and what fine-grained reactivity gives us, can we use that information to more accurately detect that this component is done rendering, therefore I can stream this out to the client. Meanwhile, this other component is still rendering, so I'm going to wait for that one to finish. That's a complex challenge, and we'll have to see how well we can make that work, but it's something we're definitely interested in. We're also looking into partial hydration, which is the idea of saying that can we have different parts of the page hydrate independently of each other? So instead of having just the whole page hydrate all at once, can we get sort of islands, if you're familiar with that concept? Can we get an island of interactivity on one part and then when the user interacts with that, hydrate it and make it interactive. Meanwhile, there's other pieces and other islands on the page that maybe stay dehydrated and aren't interactive. Can we make things more lazy until the user starts using them? And so there's a bunch of open questions here. Definitely don't have answers to all of these yet, but it's something we're interested in exploring in the future. I realize I'm running a little bit behind from where I'm supposed to be. It was supposed to be like a 35-minute talk. I might be a little bit behind that, but we'll see. I'll try and wrap.
No worries at all.
I can.
Keep it up.
Yeah. So next big thing I want to talk about is testing. And so in the past, there's at least historically, we've used Karma to be able to drive Angular unit testing. Karma is an open source project for being able to start up a browser, inject some JavaScript code and unit tests, run those tests in the browser, and then report results back to Angular. And that has worked great for us in the past. We use it internally at Google. We're really big fans of Karma. The challenge is that Karma was recently deprecated. There's on the GitHub project, they have a deprecation notice there, which we're very sad about. Karma has done a lot of great stuff for us in the past, and we're sad to see that. Sad to see it go. But we definitely appreciate all the awesome work that they've done on Karma. We salute all the work that they've done in supporting testing over the years. The web ecosystem has come a long way since Karma was first created, so we're excited to see how things move forward from here. And one challenge that we have on Angular is, what do we do? Where do we go from here? And it's kind of a big question. And so this is going to be a two-part solution that we're trying to do here. The first part is that we're looking into Web Test Runner. If you're not familiar with this, it's a test runner in a similar vein to Karma. It's able to spin up a real browser, inject some code into that, run it in that context, and report results back. This is developed by Modern Web, which is a community group focused on building tooling for the emerging needs of a more modern web ecosystem that isn't as bogged down by older legacy decisions that aren't as applicable anymore with recent advancements in browsers. So the idea here is, can we migrate Angular tests from Karma to Web Test Runner? And this is a big challenge for sure, but our current expectation or sort of hypothesis with this is that we believe it should be possible to configure Web Test Runner to use Jasmine under the hood and be able to create a very similar testing experience to what Karma was originally. And that it should be possible to almost ng update, switch the configuration from Karma to Web Test Runner, and as a result, get something that all your tests still pass. You don't necessarily need to deal with them, and it's not a big complex migration that you have to deal with. And it's still TBD to see if that hypothesis proves true, but this is at least the general idea we've been going for and something we've been interested in exploring. So keep an eye out for this. It's something that's going to be coming soon. The next big thing you might have heard of, and I think I saw a question about earlier, was Jest. We've been exploring, experimenting with adding Jest support. Jest is another test runner similar to Karma and Web Test Runner, but the main difference with Jest is that it runs its tests inside Node and does not use a real browser. The idea there is that Node is a little bit quicker to start up and deal with, and you get some benefits from doing that. And so we've been looking into this. We have some experimental support for Jest, and it's been certainly an interesting ride, and we've been learning a lot in the process here. So this is something that we're kind of seeing as an alternative to that browser testing environment. If you aren't a fan of browsers and you want to be testing in Node, this is a great option to be able to support that. So there's a blog post linked here with more details about what our unit testing strategy is going to be going forward. But essentially sort of this combination of, let's migrate existing tests to Web Test Runner, keep good compatibility there, and then we'll also add support for Jest for users who are interested in going down that approach. The last thing I'll talk about with respect to testing is that recently Puppeteer has added direct support for Angular through a schematics package. So you can ng add this Puppeteer package, and that will set up Puppeteer for you, configure everything, and set it up with ng ete. So you just run that one command, it'll run Puppeteer for you, and everything is, all those challenges are just solved for you. And I'm a big fan of Puppeteer. I think that's super awesome. So if you're looking for an end-to-end test runner, or maybe you still have some protractor tests lying around, this is a great option to be able to migrate those. They even have a migration path for existing protractor tests and how to migrate them to Puppeteer. This is still pretty early, so there might be some rough edges on it, but I'm a big fan of Puppeteer. I'm really excited about this. I am very glad to see this kind of integration. So check it out if that seems interesting to you. Last big product I'll talk about is DevTools. So the biggest feature we've been pushing for DevTools is visualizing the dependency injection graph. If you're like me, dependency injection is difficult to understand, difficult to debug, tricky to understand. Why do I have two instances of this service and they have different state in them? What happened here? Why am I not able to inject this specific thing from the router, let's say? And so what's nice here is, can we make DevTools be able to visualize this, show you the whole graph, help explain to you why things got injected, why things didn't get ejected, and help you able to understand that process. And I know I am really going to appreciate this when it comes out, because it's going to make things so much easier to understand. And this is really the big feature that we've been working on for DevTools. Coming up, we do have some other things kind of in the pipeline for what would be after that. Some ideas here are, can we get DevTools to detect Angular apps in iframes? Currently, it kind of only looks on the main frame, which works for most apps. But if you're sticking it inside an iframe, maybe you have multiple apps on a page, things can get complicated there. So can we add more direct support for running in iframes? Next thing that I'm really thinking about is that signals are becoming a big thing in the Angular ecosystem. And we're still early right now, but over the next few years, this might be even more integrated into the Angular framework. Signal components RFC was out there. It seemed to be getting a lot of interest in the community. People are excited about that. So when signal components become a thing, that means that people are going to be debugging these things a lot more often. There's going to be challenges of, I updated this signal, how come the view didn't update? Why didn't it? How and when do signals change? How is this affecting change detection? Those kinds of questions. Things get very complicated. And I can see there's a lot of love for signals right now. I definitely share that feeling. And so the question here is, how can we make this easier to debug within DevTools, right? How can we help address this problem as it becomes a bigger challenge for developers? And the last thing I want to call out is that we're investigating how we can visualize the router configuration. Can we display what routes are loaded, what things are not loaded, what components or routes are displayed or pulled into the bundle that aren't loaded yet, right? Maybe you can get bundle size optimizations by deferring some of your routes. Can we detect and escalate those to you and provide a path to being able to fix those? So I'll try to wrap up with maybe some rough ideas of where we're going kind of in a slightly longer term. And there's a lot of complexity to this, and I unfortunately don't have the time to dive into all the specifics. But the way that I think of it is that we sort of put things into three different categories. First, we sort of have the developer experience of how can we make your builds faster, right? Through ESBuild, through HMR, through optional type checking, all that kind of stuff about making your edit refresh experience, right? The time it takes to edit a file all the way to seeing it in the browser. How can we make that as fast and smooth as possible? The next big step is just DevTools, right? Making things easier to debug, making it easier to understand the performance of your application, finding gaps in those things, and trying to simplify that experience as best that we can. And the last piece I didn't have time to get into here was VS Code extension of what kind of improvements can we make there? I think in the past, the VS Code extension has kind of really just been the language service of how do we do syntax highlighting and things on Angular templates. But I think there's a lot more opportunity for even more features we can add there. Can we get something where we have more direct schematics integration, like right click on a file and say new component, and then you just get an Angular component there? Can we make that faster? Make that a smoother experience? Also, I would love to see is that I was complaining about Angular.json earlier as being way too complicated. Can we make like a rich text editor in a form that visualizes some of this with help and tooltips that explains what these things do? And so I think that would be really powerful for helping build confidence in developers that they can understand and edit their Angular.json file in a reasonable way. Next big pillar is about performance. This is where a lot of our server-side rendering stuff has been coming from, right? We want to make it really easy and accessible to use server-side rendering. So that's making it just faster in general, that the whole application builder is doing, trying to make it easier to adopt, making deployments faster, all the stuff I was talking about earlier for edge workers and things like that. Not to mention more on the hydration side. What improvements can we do there for actually like making the runtime faster and making the Angular application smarter? There's also a bunch of optimizations I didn't get a chance to talk about that we've been landing over the last few versions. For instance, with ESBuild, we will actually detect any eagerly loaded resources like JavaScript or CSS that needs to be immediately loaded on the page, we'll extract that and add preload hints to your HTML to make the browser start that download process even sooner and sort of remove another cascade from the waterfall, which has a really huge impact. We also already do critical CSS inlining. That's where we take the CSS that's necessary to display the initial part of your application and force that way up to the top of the process and defer all the rest of the CSS. So that's another and deferring the work that we don't need yet. And also just generally making SSR easier to use, right? What can we do to make it as smooth and easy as possible to adopt server-side rendering? The last piece I want to talk about is sort of building the ecosystem that we're sort of stewards of on the Angular team, right? We want to update our testing story just because this, aside from getting off of deprecated infrastructure on Karma, but also aligns us with best practices in the ecosystem. Jest is super popular. A lot of people want to use it. So what are the benefits we can gain by standardizing on these kinds of tools? Not to mention there's a lot of challenges around how do we build this community and how do we scaffold it over time, right? We recently landed some schematics utilities for making standalone easier to adopt for libraries and other projects that have existing ng module APIs and want to help move their users over to standalone. These are all things that are all about sort of building this ecosystem. And in general, we want to be talking with a lot of the tools and systems that build on top of Angular, whether that's things like Analog or NX or any of these other tools that build on top of Angular. How can we work with them to improve stability and to foster a productive ecosystem? These are conversations we're already having with a lot of them. How can we make things integrate better and smoother and get to a point where you can ng update from your from v16 to v17 on launch day and not have anything break? That's a big challenge when you're working with an ecosystem as big as Angular. So we're trying to do whatever we can to smooth that process over. So with that all together and going way over time for what I was originally intended, I'll just end with a call to action to, ng update. We work very hard on trying to put together, all this awesome work to try to solve real problems that developers have. And, if you don't ng update, you don't get to experience it. And that makes me very sad. And I don't want to be sad. So, ng updates, take advantage of this. A lot of the stuff I've talked about is in developer preview right now and will be stabilized soon. So take a look at those, try out server-side rendering, try out hydration. Doing all of these cool things helps give us feedback about how we can improve things and just makes ecosystem improved overall. So really excited. And I hope this was helpful in sort of sharing some context about what Angular tooling does and how we impact the ecosystem. So I have a slide link and the QR code also goes to the slide. So check that out if that's helpful to you. I am also on Mastodon at Devil Without a Cause. If you want to chat more about tools or the web ecosystem or just, see me messing around with random things, definitely always happy to chat with the community. So yeah, I guess thanks, Kevin, and for having me on here. And, I guess hopefully we can maybe look at some questions here.
All righty. Yeah, we're not done with you yet, but just to reiterate, don't make Doug sad. Please ng update and let us know how you like it. Keeping Doug happy is an important thing on our team. All right. So yeah, I have about an even dozen questions. Michael Face says, great presentation. Thank you. And Michael also asked a bunch of questions. So yeah, I will pop the presentation. Well, no, I'll just leave it there. Why not? Okay, so the first question, I think you kind of addressed this a little bit, but I don't know if there's more detail you want to go into. But Michael Faith asks, how is the Jest integration going?
Yeah, sorry, the light is turning off again. I'm still here. I'm still in this room, I swear. Yeah, so Jest integration. Yeah, so I did talk about that a bit. It's definitely something we're still exploring. Currently, we have experimental support, which is very early. It is something you can play around with, but it's not really documented yet, and it's more of a proof of concept at this stage. The big question we're trying to answer right now is that typically when you try to run TypeScript in Jest, there's a TS Jest project which does a lot of this transpilation. That transpilation happens inside of Jest itself. And this is the way that a lot of projects use Jest, sort of having special presets or transforms that make the changes they need to do. The challenge is that Angular's build process is pretty complex and pretty involved. And so one of the things we're experimenting with is, does it make sense to have a similar transform for Angular under the hood, as the way that a lot of community projects have been doing this? Or does it make sense to sort of pre-build the application and sort of basically do an ng build first and then take the JavaScript output and pass that into Jest? There's a lot of sort of trade-offs being made there around performance and maintenance and scalability. So we're still experimenting with this, and that's kind of where we're currently been, trying to make the right decision there so that as we move forward, we have something that's performant and scalable and maintainable and all those ABOL words. So that's really where we are right now. It's something to keep an eye on. And yeah, hopefully we'll have more improvements there soon.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have another question from Michael. Do you have a most anticipated tooling feature in V17?
Ooh.
Ideally, something you could talk about.
Yeah, so I talked about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's tricky to pick just one. I will caveat. We'll start with the caveat that we typically try not to commit to specific features in specific versions, just because things change, plans change. Something seems like a really good idea up front. We try and do it, and then a bunch of things break, and we discover things that we didn't realize before. So sometimes things don't happen. But for something that I'm hopeful will land in 17, again, not committing to 17, but something that I'm hopeful about, I think would be a lot of the ES build stuff. I think we're getting very close to being able to enable this by default for new applications and being able to ng update existing applications. I think that's going to go a long way towards improving build times for a lot of developers. People have been really excited about this. We've seen a lot of interest in the community, so I'm very excited to see where that goes.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question from Ambroise Bazier. When Angular applications are becoming larger, the rebuild is taking too much time. Does Angular tooling have a project to help improve this?
Yeah, well, if my most anticipated feature lands, this will hopefully be addressed there. I think the ES build is kind of the biggest thing right now. And as I was talking about earlier, if I can find my slides again, we have future projects around the build side, right? First one is ES build, but then we've also got things like, can we do type checking lazily and do that in the background so that you can get your JavaScript and view your application significantly faster. And then just sort of sometime later, the TypeScript will tell you whether or not there's type issues, as well as also HMR. How can we use hot module replacement to make things even faster there? So I think we definitely have a lot of projects in the pipeline to make your builds faster. And we think it's a big part of the Angular developer experience. So that's definitely something we're going to be focusing on going forward.
All right, great. Back to Michael. Will there be any attempts to improve the PNP, for example, Yarn development experience with Angular? It's improved since NGCC removal, but there's still some friction.
Yeah, so we've definitely made a lot of improvements here. Charles is the one who's mainly been focused on that. I need to double check with him, but my understanding is that we've solved most of those issues. There is, I think, a pinned issue in the Angular CLI repo talking about this. So let me double check. Is that still pinned? Maybe it's not pinned. But it's one of the more upvoted issues. I would definitely say to check there if there's still things that are giving you trouble. And definitely post on there if there's still things that we need to fix. My understanding is that we're most of the way there, if not all the way. So if we missed something, definitely post on there and we can try to make sure to address that, because Yarn PNP and all that kind of stuff, we really want to have a good story for that to make that easier for developers. So definitely post there if there's anything that we're still missing.
All right. And then back to Ambroise. I think you talked a little bit about end-to-end testing earlier, but just in case anything was missed, it's in this question. Mm-hmm. So end-to-end testing, or end-to-end was removed from ng-new scaffold. Are you planning to keep it that way? Maybe have end-to-end testing with Cypress?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so end-to-end testing, this is one of those more like philosophical questions about how integrated should Angular be with end-to-end testing. And our sort of view on this is that end-to-end testing is almost kind of an orthogonal concern to what Angular is. The idea is that Angular fundamentally is focused on, we want to make your development in the browser easier. We want to make things faster, have bindings, reactivity, and rendering, make all those things really awesome. End-to-end testing by its very nature is done outside of this context, right? And in fact, it shouldn't even know you're running Angular, right? You should have end-to-end tests that are querying the document directly, that are accessing the elements based on what users would be doing, right? User clicks this button and then they see that this text appears, right? The fact that it's running Angular under the hood is just kind of an implementation detail, and that's the way intent tests are supposed to be. So when it comes to something like how protractors evolved, we're kind of trying to distance some of that from that, of saying that, well, intent testing is a separate thing. We're not going to have that direct layer of integration in those special cases for Angular. Now that said, what we can do is try and have better integration with existing intent testing providers, right? This is a common problem that a lot of Angular developers are going to deal with. So can we make it easier to integrate some of those? And currently what we have is you can ng add Cypress, I think it's Cypress schematics. There's also, we have a setup for Nightwatch. We have a setup for WebDriver IO. And I was just talking earlier about Puppeteer, right? Those are all integrations that we have. You can ng add these packages. And we're pretty happy with that setup right now as a way to plug in these external intent testing providers without being too coupled to Angular itself. So I expect that's probably going to continue for the foreseeable future. Ultimately, it's always something that we're reevaluating and thinking about. But this is sort of our approach about how this is sort of a distinct problem, and where Angular fits in is more about making it easier to integrate rather than solving that problem directly for you.
All right, perfect. Lance Finney asks, the app I'm on doesn't use the default builder currently because of the micro front ends we have to live in. Is there a path to ES build for that?
Yeah, so micro front ends are definitely sort of the biggest use case for the way the biggest kind of coupling to Webpack that exists in the community. They're definitely a popular solution, and they do require module federation, which is a Webpack feature. So it's still a little bit TBD. Certainly for it is something we've been actively looking into. There are paths to doing micro front ends and that kind of approach outside of Webpack. I think Manfred Stayer has been experimenting with this. I don't know how far along the prototype is. I haven't checked in on that in a while. But there are approaches with things like import maps for how you can sort of be able to dynamically import specific pieces of it and share a common runtime between multiple builds. So it's definitely feasible. I think one challenge that we have is going to be figuring out what the right path is to migrate your existing Webpack micro front end into that kind of system. And that's still a bit TBD. Once we have a better sense of it, I think we'll probably end up having a bit more guidance for the community about how you actually migrate these things and what the path to ES build is. It is important to keep in mind that even if we do sometime soon ship ES build as the default, or even ng update applications to it, there would still be an opt-out if you still needed Webpack for the immediate future. And we probably wouldn't get rid of Webpack until we had a clearer vision of what that path forward is and give it enough time for people to move over to it. So that's kind of our current thinking around micro front ends in particular.
Alrighty. And Michael asks, how does something like analog.js relate to these new SSR features?
Yeah, so analog, at least the way that I kind of think about it, is that it's sort of a meta framework building on top of Angular, trying to address and improve some of what that experience is and add those sort of meta frameworky features to Angular. The big one being file-based routing, I know, is kind of the main one that they do, but there are other pieces to analog. And so I don't think it is directly related or impacted. I think it'd be probably an interesting conversation for Brandon, the maintainer, as to how to adopt certain things. I honestly don't know too well exactly how like the application builder could fit into that and whether or not that would be useful to analog. I don't think it directly impacts the file-based routing feature. I think that can still work exactly as it has been. Certainly it's something that is, I know it has a lot of custom integration within analog. So might be a better question for Brandon as to exactly how it would fit into the scope. But I expect there will hopefully be primitives here that he can build on top of and create an even better experience with a lot of these projects.
Alrighty. Michael Faith asks, does Angular material work with the new hydration?
Sorry, something in my throat. Yes, so we've taken a special focus on Angular material. We want to make sure that that is updated and compatible. It is something you can use Angular material. You can hydrate with it. That will work out of the box without any issues. I did talk before about how certain components aren't compatible. And what that means is that they're doing those specific patterns of like, oh, on ng on an int, we need to query the DOM and remove something. Angular material does do a bit of that. So there are some components that aren't compatible out of the box. But we do support a feature called, I think it's ng skip hydration, which basically tells the framework that, hey, this component is not compatible, so just re-render everything under that component, in the old way, but you can still hydrate everything else normally. And so what we've done is we've updated Angular material components to put this skip hydration flag where appropriate on those components. So as a user, you really shouldn't need to worry about it. You just use the component. If it can, it'll hydrate normally. If not, it'll go back to re-rendering. But as a user, it just solves that problem for you. So you really don't need to worry about it.
Alrighty, and then we have one comment and one question from Edipo. First of all, visualizing the injections and debug signals would be amazing.
That would be amazing. I am very much looking forward to it.
Yeah. And then the question is, are there any plans for a WebStorm extension also?
Yeah, so historically, so there is a WebStorm extension for Angular. However, I believe it is maintained by JetBrains, not by Angular. So it's not something that we have had too much involvement with. We have had conversations with them and discussions to just sort of, hear where we think the Angular ecosystem is, what kind of improvements they could add that would have the biggest impact, just sort of lending our expertise and knowledge in that space in a way that can help them. So there have been conversations there, but it is very much a distinct implementation. I would love in the future at some point to be able to more closely integrate either with them or having a separate extension. I think right now the challenge is that, Angular only has so many people on it, so many things that we can work on at any given time. And as you can see by these columns here, there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline. So I'd love to be able to do more in that space at some point, but I don't think it's on the foreseeable future just right now.
Alrighty. Alcatraz asks, do you have any idea of how that could work or entail? We're talking about existing ng schematics. He likes the Vite configuration for plugins, so he's in favor. I think this might be referring to something that you said in the moment. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not too sure on the context of this.
We can come back to Alcatraz. I think you're still in the chat. If you can remind us of what you were responding to there, then we can address that.
It probably made sense in the moment, but
yeah. SD asked, looking for a good logging tool for front-end Angular. Any recommendations?
Ooh, unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with that space. Definitely, I know logging is a big complex thing. I know Sentry is popular, but I'm not sure if that's quite logging or monitoring. There's differences between those. So I don't think I can really point to anything in particular. But definitely, I know there's lots of people are dealing with that particular problem. And so I'm sure you can find things online for that.
All right. So back to the last question. Alcatraz just responded. Minko recently commented on LogRocket podcast that maybe using Vite instead of Angular CLI is something that should happen. So I guess that's
yes. Okay. That's helpful. So yes, there have been sort of some conversations. Actually, Minko has an item that I need to get back to him about on this topic specifically.
No pressure.
Essentially, just sort of asking like, well, Angular CLI is great. It does a lot of awesome stuff for you, but it is kind of a bit of a closed ecosystem. Mm-hmm. That's not 100% true, right? You can add custom builders, you can add custom schematics. We do have integration points for things, but it often means that when you have like, oh, I want to generate a GraphQL configuration, let's say, you kind of have to have like a custom Angular builder to do that. You have to directly integrate this with Angular. And so I think what Minko is kind of getting at is, can we make this a little bit easier? Can we have just like, oh, you have the Vite plugin for running this GraphQL code gen. Can we just make that work with Angular? Whether that's in the CLI, whether that's making Angular more pluggable to existing tools like Vite. I think exactly what that looks like is still TBD. Mm-hmm. It's something we're thinking about. We haven't really made a decision on that one way or another. It's maybe something we want to involve more of the community to see. So definitely I keep an eye out for that in the future, but there's still early conversations going on. And so I don't think we're quite ready to commit to anything just there, but it's definitely something we're considering.
Okay. And then Edipo asks, will ng update manage to handle upgrades from v13?
Yeah, so the typical suggestion that we give is that you should generally only ng update one version at a time. We've had ng update for a long time, so you can ng update from v13 to v14, and then upgrade from 14 to 15, et cetera. And you can keep going. So there's absolutely a path here. I think it's just one of those challenges of, biting off little pieces of the migration at a time. You don't necessarily have to do all of this at once. And by taking those steps, you're able to make things better and get even a little bit more of those features each time. So it's really just going through that process. There is, if I can remember the URL, I think it's update.angular.io. Yes, update.angular.io, which gives it lets you specify the versions that you're trying to upgrade between, and it gives a great breakdown on like what are the things that have changed, what are some of the things you should be thinking about, what stuff went away that maybe you have to address, and so that can be super helpful for these kinds of upgrades.
Alrighty. And then 2 questions from Justin White. First one is there a technical reason why the builder is ES-build instead of Vite, also like analog?
Yeah, this is a bit nuanced. I think a lot of the reasoning comes down to we started initially with ES-build to see what can we do to make things faster, how can we get some benefits here, and ES-build was kind of the right approach for what that is. Angular CLI itself sort of handles a lot of the build system functionality for you. Vite is kind of unique in that it is a build system, but then also a dev server. And so we could use Vite for the build system, which is what we did historically with Webpack. But within Angular CLI, we found that difficult to maintain over time. And so this is something that we wanted to move away from. And Angular itself has other abstractions like builders to be able to manage some of that for you. So what we're trying to do is leverage some of that within Angular CLI to use that for the build system and instead treat ES-build and Vite as distinct tools that operate on specific files rather than closely coupling these things together. So that's kind of where we currently are. And as a user and developer, it really doesn't matter too much because these are all implementation details of Angular. But this is absolutely something that we continually reevaluate and look at. Maybe at some point in the future, it does make sense to use Vite as the primary driver for this. That's definitely something we can consider. So it's one of those things we're always thinking about and always exploring. But at least for right now, it made sense to kind of think of these as separate tools.
All right, and then the final question also from Justin is, you mentioned schematics to help migrate to server-side rendering. Will this be able to help with the injection of document?
Sure. So if I'm understanding this correctly, I think the main question here is sort of about how does this work with existing DOM APIs. So if you're trying to directly access the DOM in the server, what is the impact there? And so the main thing that we have set up for server-side rendering is that we use Domino as a DOM emulation library, where it sort of makes it look like there is a document and you can use that, even though this is all running inside the server. And so within that context, because DOM emulation is handling this, you don't strictly need to inject the document and be able to use it. You can use the regular document global. I think that's not typically recommended, but it is something you can do there. One thing we are exploring in the future is how can we remove this DOM emulation layer and make it so that you don't need to access the document directly. And that's a bit of a challenge, but we've been exploring various APIs to do that. Some things for 16.2 that we shipped were after render and after next render.
Yeah.
Those two things exist primarily to be able to run client-side code specifically inside this context and not on the server, which means that if you needed to do something like remove a DOM element, let's say, that's something that you could put in after render. And that's something that will happen on the client, but not the server. And so based on that, it would be more compatible with hydration. It means that you don't need DOM emulation to access that because you're not actually using the DOM on the server. And so there's a lot more complexity that goes into that. There's a lot more hooks where you might want to access the browser.
Sure.
So this is kind of an ongoing design problem of how can we make Angular more compatible with these? How can we handle those patterns in a way that doesn't directly rely on DOM emulation? So it's going to be an ongoing challenge and something that the framework will continue to evolve and address. But that's at least kind of our direction in that particular path.
All righty. Well, I think we are fresh out of questions, and I also want to protect your time. So I just want to mention a few things at the end. So first of all, thank you all for coming and joining us today. It's been really great to be able to chat with you directly and answer questions. And I want to give a big thank you to Doug for taking the time out of his evening and coming here and chatting with you all, and giving us all of this great information about what's coming up.
Thank you so much for organizing all this and setting it up.
I know,
a lot of time and effort to make this happen, so I really appreciate it,
Kevin. So a couple of things I want to mention just before we close out. If you weren't able to watch all of this, or if you want to go back and rewatch anything, this is recorded. It will be available at the same URL on our YouTube page. So definitely check that out. It might even be available on Twitter. I'm not sure about Twitter, but definitely on YouTube. So go check it out. YouTube.com/Angular. And we have a developer satisfaction survey that we're hoping to get more feedback on. I have a URL here. Please check that out. It's a great way for us to get feedback directly from you. It's a great way for you all to help influence the future of Angular. And we are open source in spirit and in reality, and we definitely want to have everybody's input and help us drive this great framework forward. And then the last thing, if you want more streams from the Angular team, there's one coming up next week on Friday. You can join Mark Thompson and Jeremy Elborn from the Angular team as well, and they will be doing gaming stuff. So if you have any more questions, feel free to swing by then, or you can just watch them either build games or play games. I'm not exactly sure what's going to be happening there, but either way, it'll be fun, and I'm sure the expression in the streets will be mentioned at least once or twice. Alrighty, so thank you again, Doug. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I think we can wrap it up there.
Thanks so much. Really glad to be here.
Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.